Hi ladies, this is lesson 5.4, and in this lesson we are going to talk about congruent triangles. So we have a couple key terms here, congruent triangles and corresponding parts. So if you remember from lesson 5.3, we talked about corresponding parts a little bit already. And we talked about corresponding parts in terms of mapping to. So if we said something like segment AB maps to segment BC, we use that arrow. Okay, so remember that arrow indicates that term, that term maps to. And when we're mapping using either reflection or rotation or translation, we have to make sure to map each point from the pre-image to the image. Okay, so every point goes from the pre-image to the corresponding image point. When we're talking about congruent triangles, we're still talking about a form of mapping, except we are not actually translating or shifting or reflecting or rotating this image. If we did rotate it or translate it or reflect it, it could overlap this congruent triangle, but that's not what we're doing. We're not actually mapping it. We are just lining up the pieces, okay, so that it would overlap if we mapped it in the right way. So we have a definition for congruent triangles, and it's two triangles are congruent if and only if, corresponding sides and corresponding angles are congruent. Since we have this IFF, remember that means if and only if. And in an if and only if statement, the conditional statement is true, but the converse is also true. So the converse, if you remember, switches the if and the then part of the statement. So the converse of the statement would be if corresponding sides and corresponding angles of a triangle are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. So this whole lesson is about congruent triangles. So in order to have congruent triangles, all of the corresponding sides and angles have to be congruent. And if they are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. So instead of saying maps to, instead of having a mapping statement from a pre-image to an image, we have a congruence statement. So this triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. That's the congruence statement. If those two triangles are congruent, then the corresponding parts have to be congruent. That means corresponding angles and corresponding sides have to be congruent. We're not going to ever say points are congruent because a point is a point. Okay, it doesn't have any dimension. It's just a location. We do have dimensions when we talk about angles and lines though, or not lines, segments. Okay, so when we have sides, which are measured in segments, we do have dimension to that. We have a length. An angle, we have a degree measure. So if those two triangles are congruent, then angle A has to be congruent to its corresponding part, which is angle X. Angle B has to be congruent to its corresponding part, which is angle Y. And angle C has to be congruent to its corresponding part, which is angle Z. So that's the first part of the statement. Remember we said corresponding sides and angles. Okay, so we got the angles part. Now let's look at the sides. So AB, those are the first two letters in our first statement. They have to be congruent to the corresponding parts. So AB corresponds to XY. So segment AB is congruent to segment XY. BC corresponds to YZ. And AC corresponds to XZ. Okay, so if those two triangles are congruent, that means all of these things are congruent. Let's look at example 1. So example 1 says, in the figure below, ABC is congruent to XYZ. Mark which sides and angles are congruent. Well, let's mark the angles first. So A corresponds to X. So I'm going to mark A congruent to X. B corresponds to Y. So I'm going to mark B congruent to Y. And then lastly, C corresponds to Z. So I'm going to mark C congruent to Z. Now I have to mark all of my sides congruent. So AB corresponds to XY. BC corresponds to YZ. And AC corresponds to XZ. So now I've marked all of my corresponding sides and corresponding angles congruent. Now, whether or not these triangles look congruent or not isn't really the issue. We have to mark the diagram based on the statement. Okay? And if we're given a diagram, we'll have to write the statement based on the diagram. So look for the markings on your diagram. Do not say angle A looks like it's congruent to angle Y, so I'm going to mark those. Do not do that. Okay, you have to have a given statement or some kind of deductive reasoning that leads you to a statement. Okay, so here I use the corresponding parts. Now, if I were to actually take this and slide it over here, I can see that A and Y, I'm looking at these angles right now, and they are not marked congruent. So I could just turn this, and maybe I have to flip it. So it's a rotation and a reflection. And I could line it up so that my triangles are congruent. Let's see. So if I reflected it and I flipped it, I could line these one over top of the other and show that all of the corresponding parts match. Now, it doesn't ask us to actually do that. It doesn't ask us to actually reflect it or actually rotate it, or it doesn't ask us what kind of transformation we would need. But if you have two congruent triangles, you can transform one triangle so it directly overlaps the other triangle. Okay, which is what I would do after I reflected it and rotated it. Okay, let's look at this second example now. So this second example says for each set of triangles shown below, write a congruent statement. So here we actually have the markings already. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and highlight the corresponding parts. And maybe I'll use a highlighter. Okay, so I and K, those two angles are congruent. G and J, those two angles are congruent. And angle H in both triangles is congruent to itself. So that's where I'm going to start. Oops. Okay, so I can say triangle. I'm just going to go yellow, blue, green. So triangle IHG is congruent to triangle KHJ. Okay, now I have to actually put my symbols in here. Now when I made this statement, I only looked at the angles, so now I'm just going to go back and double check that my sides are congruent. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight my sides as I say them. So IH, I mean, IH and KH. Both of those are marked with 3 tick marks. Okay, so those are congruent. HG and HJ are both marked with 2 tick marks, so that's good. And then lastly, IG and KJ. IG and KJ, those are both marked with 1 tick mark, so I'm good there too. Okay, now I'm going to write a congruent statement for this second set of triangles. And I'm going to start with the angles just because I think that's a little bit easier. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. So BCA is congruent to triangle DFE. Okay, so those 2 triangles are congruent. Now again, I just went by the angle measures, and that's just one part of it. I have to also check that the corresponding sides are congruent. So BC has 2 tick marks, and DF has 2 tick marks. That's good. So those sides are congruent. CA and FE, I'm going to check next. So CA and FE both have 3 tick marks, so that's good. And then lastly, BA and DE. BA and DE both have 1 tick mark, so that's good. You have to check all sides and all angles. Okay, you cannot just check the angles. That's a good starting point, but you have to do both. You need sides and angles to show triangles are congruent. Okay, and then let's look at the last example. So in this example, it says that RST is congruent to XYZ. First thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go around and mark my angles congruent. Okay, so R is congruent to X, Y is congruent to S, and Z is congruent to T. And this is 90 degrees. So Z, I'm just going to go ahead and mark that 90 degrees. We need to find the value of N. Well, I know that angle Y is congruent to angle S. And I know that angle S is equal to 50 degrees. So I'm going to first use my congruent statement like I did to mark my triangle, and I'm going to find the angle that corresponds to Y. That angle is S. Now I can write an equation to solve for N. So angle S is 50, and that's equal to angle Y, and angle Y is 2N plus 10. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides, and I get 40 is equal to 2N. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I get N is equal to 20. So please jot down any questions or notes that you have, and we can discuss those next time I see you in class. Thank you.